Good morning, and we are here to discuss a little bit about bridging. And as we take a look at bridging, when I usually present bridging in the class, we are talking about cross-linguistic connections. We're talking about identifying cognates. We're talking about things like metalinguistic awareness, and really learning how to capitalize on those connections between English and Spanish in the bilingual classroom and even in the ESL classroom. So bridging is what we call it puente lingüístico in bilingual spaces. So bridging is basically creating a bridge between academic vocabulary in English and academic vocabulary in Spanish. And and of course, this can take place with any language. This does not have to, take place only with Spanish, right? It's just in Texas, we have a really high, over 80% of our English learners are from Hispanic, Latino, Spanish-speaking homes. So their first language, primary language is Spanish. So going back to bridging, we're identifying cross-linguistic connections, right? We're identifying areas where both languages converge and there is a commonality between both languages, right? And why do we do this? So that students, and so bilingual learners, can identify high-level academic vocabulary and learn to leverage that, right? As they grow up, they can see, oh, this word I already know. Este es parecido a la palabra en inglés, right? Or este es parecido a esta palabra en español. So they can start saying, I see the relationship. This is like biodiversity, but that's kind of like the word biodiversidad, right? So they start making those connections, and they actually do better in secondary when they have this metalinguistic awareness. This is what it looks like in Spanish. This is what it looks like in English. I see how they connect, right? And so what I did here is I'm sharing one of the bridges that I did in my class as a classroom teacher. And I was teaching science at the time in Espanol. So we looked at the words, matter, mass, weight, particles, and atoms. And we wrote them out. Of course, the vocabulary in the class was being presented in Spanish. So it was la materia, la masa, el peso, partículas, los átomos. And so we had those 5 words, because when we bridge, we want to essentially typically bridge, between 5 to 7 words. If you bridge a whole lot of words, it gets to be a bit much. So I tried to keep my bridge focused on the most critical 5 to 7 words that we were covering that week or in that unit. All right. So I did put out the terminology there in Spanish, and then we put out the terminology in English. And this was a very interactive activity for our class, right? The students were helping me generate the English words just as a whole group on the floor. We did it on this anchor chart type of, the students on the floor, and I'm sitting on a chair with an anchor chart and a marker. And so they're helping me generate these words in English. And then the next piece is very critical, because a lot of people stop at just the flat bridge. And you can do that if you're in an ESL class, and I would understand that, right? But it is always still good to have a conversation about leveraging what they notice is the same and what they notice is different, right? And we call that contrastive analysis. So this is like I'd say a 2-dimensional bridge. Like, they didn't go into the contrastive analysis on this bridge, although they did bridge the language. So I think that this would be like a good bridge, because all bridging is good in multilingual classrooms. But I do feel like there's different degrees of implementation. So when we would do the bridge, right, we had those 5 terms, and then I would ask them, what do you notice? ¿De qué se dan cuenta? What do you notice when you look at the 5 words in English and in Spanish? And I would give them time to generate answers. And then they would raise their hands, in the group, and they'd say things like, well, I noticed that in Spanish we use articles, el, la, los, las. And I said, okay, so I write that down on the anchor chart on bottom. We notice that se usa acentos, perdón, se usan los artículos, right? And I write that down at the bottom. Now, this could be written in English, but it was about my situation was a dual language classroom. So I would write that in on the Spanish side. Okay, we use articles, el, la, los, las. All right. What else do you know? And the students are popping around and talking and having academic discussions. And then they say, well, I noticed that in English, we use double consonants. I'm like, okay, so we use double consonants. That's written down. What else do you notice? Well, in Spanish, they use accents over some of the vowels. Okay, so that's written down. So now we're doing, again, contrastive analysis of both languages. What else do you notice? Well, I'm seeing cognados, they're seeing cognates. And I said, okay, well, what do you notice when you look at the cognates? Well, I noticed that matter looks a lot like materia. And I said, okay, so what's the same? Let's underline what's the same. So we underline that in orange, right? And masa with mas, and then peso and weight, peso and weight, there's no relationship there. So we put no hay relación. Those are not cognates. And particles and partículas, right? Then we have the atoms and átomos. So we would do contrastive analysis. And then I would have the students on a Post-it note generate ideas of what they learned. And so they would, I would say tag. They would tag the anchor chart with all of their Post-it notes and their ideas, because when students, and this is just a good instructional practice, when students are providing their input or they have their name on a piece of learning, like on an anchor chart, right, that's created effectively in that moment, right, they take ownership of that learning and they feel represented. So this is this is a piece in the strategy, I guess, that is built around the need for identity, the need for belonging, the need for contribution and community, right? So students seeing their work represented on the wall or being represented on anchor charts in this case, this supports them feeling a sense of belonging linguistically, culturally, right? Academically, they're seen, and that is really good for their affective filter and their socio-emotional wellness. So also they were able to answer on their Post-it notes in English or in Spanish. So here we have, a little bit of feedback from one of the students, que las palabras en inglés a veces tienen letras repetidas, so that we mentioned the repeated letters, in English, the repeated consonants. Y en español hay muchas letras en esas palabras y también hay cognados, right? So she mentions the cognates. But bridging can be a very, very effective method. That is something that we do present in our certification courses. And we also go into the importance of contrastive analysis. So if you go into a bridging exercise, great. If you've taken that first step and you're at this stage where you are taking your unit vocabulary and you are now bridging it to a second language, I think that's fabulous. Good. But you don't have to stop there. You can go deeper into contrastive analysis and have academic conversations around how the languages are similar and how the languages are different. When it comes to our Texas exams, right? And they're talking contrastive analysis. One of the things that may be brought up is that common underlying language proficiency, and that is brought up with Jim Cummins, right? He mentions a lot with CULP and common underlying language. So anyway, hope that has helped you understanding bridging and how it can really be a game changer and open up a lot of critical linguistic conversations and academic and content understanding around your lessons.